welcome to the OxIgnite Podcast hosted by Yusuf, Raza, and Michael Hutson, two entrepreneurial MBA students at the University of Oxford. Together, we navigate the dynamic journeys of Oxford-linked founders, venture capitalists, and trailblazing innovators. Our mission: to fuel the fire in Oxford's next generation of boundary-pushing change-makers. Our fourth guest is Steven Renwick, co-founder and CEO of Tilores. Tilores is a Berlin-based startup which provides a no-code identity resolution platform to facilitate data orchestration for fraud prevention. KYC and AML teams at FinTech and E-Commerce companies. Tilores' high-performance entity resolution as a service technology deduplicates and links customer data in real time to uncover the hidden relationships between transactions, allowing its customers to significantly improve fraud prevention, data quality, and customer retention. Get a quick glimpse into the technology behind Tilores that is quickly leading it to become a preferred choice over existing solutions for prominent e-commerce and fintech players. With a diverse background spanning genetics, biochemistry, fintech, and multiple entrepreneurial ventures, Steven's journey is as fascinating as it is unique. As we delve into Steven's entrepreneurship journey leading up to founding Tilores, his advice to aspiring entrepreneurs, and his thoughts on maintaining mental wellness, be prepared for a richly informative conversation that combines tech innovation, startup lessons, and personal growth. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a data scientist, or just someone intrigued by the dynamic tech landscape, this episode promises valuable insights for everyone. Get ready, get set, get OxIgnited.
Well, hello to the OxIgnite Podcast. My guest today is Steven Renwick, the founder and CEO at Tilores. Tilores is a Berlin-based entity resolution as a service startup that helps companies prevent fraud and reduce risk through the power of connecting related data at scale. Tilores allows data scientists to match and deduplicate messy, inconsistent data at scale and in real time. So welcome to OxIgnite, Steven. Could you give us a quick overview of what Tilores does? What problems does it solve for and for whom?
Sure. I mean, you summarized it pretty well. But basically, we solve the problem of duplicate and disconnected customer data mostly. So if you imagine you have any size of e-commerce shop and say you've got a few 100,000 or a million customers, it's very likely that you have lots of duplicate customer accounts in there, either because they forgot they had an account or because someone was trying to create fraud attempts. And what we do is basically detect those duplicates in real time as they get created and connect the data together, which gives companies much better data that they can use for fraud prevention, but also to measure loyalty and try to improve retention.
That's very fascinating, and we're going to deep dive into that later in the podcast. But first, could you walk us through your professional and your personal growth journey that led to you founding Tilores?
Sure. So I'm originally a biologist by training. So my first degree was in biochemistry, and then I did a PhD in genetics in London. I worked for 5 years in the pharmaceutical sector, doing consulting mostly at a small consultancy that was based in Oxford. So I lived in Oxford before I did the MBA for 5 years. And there I got interested in kind of internet technologies because this consultancy sold database technologies. And I thought, well, I'd actually quite like to switch from pharma to internet businesses. So did the MBA to kind of do the old career sector switch. That worked quite well because after the MBA, I joined Rocket Internet. I worked for them for about nearly 2 years. Then I launched my own startup called Satago, which was based on an idea I had developed during the MBA. Ran that for about 4.5 years. Exited in 2017. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later. That was an interesting experience. But then after that, I kind of took a year out, dabbled in a few things. Joined another company in Berlin as the chief product officer. That company is a credit bureau, so selling data about people. And then we did a spin out of some technology from that credit bureau into Tilores, and that's where I am today.
All right, Tilores. Might have gotten the pronunciation wrong. actually.
That's okay.
Apologies for that. So I would imagine a few of our listeners would be MBA students, maybe from my current batch at Oxford as well. How did the Oxford MBA help you in this transition from, more of a science background to that of entrepreneurship and venture building?
Um, well, I think the main thing is that I wouldn't have made the transition as I did if I didn't have the MBA. So joining Rocket Internet was a pretty interesting experience because at that time, which was 2011, Rocket was at its kind of full strength. It was very well known for being this German investors that would copy all these US ideas and very aggressively launch them all across the world. And they wanted certain types of people. I certainly wasn't, based on my science background, the sort of person they would want to normally have, but based on the MBA, I think they sort of took that chance on me. So it really just unlocked a door, which otherwise I don't think would have been a real opportunity for me.
I hope that's the kind of switch that some of my batchmates are able to do as well through the course of the MBA. So I'm interested in learning more about the couple of years that you spent at Rocket Internet. So I know for a fact that Rocket Internet is known to be very relentlessly focused on execution. So actually, my co-founder at my previous startup was also briefly the head of HR for Lazada for all across Southeast Asia. So I've heard stories about how intense it can be over there. What were some of your main takeaways from those 2 years that you spent there? I would imagine it would have been quite the crash course in different aspects of entrepreneurship and venture building. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the two main takeaways for me were the power of very focused and very quantitatively driven execution, i.e., everything was measured down to the last cent, particularly in advertising. That was very powerful. It is the reason for some of their big successes is that they were just better at things like inventory management or advertising bidding. That's the one side. The negative side would be I really believe that many businesses that are started in this way kind of lack a soul, right? And if you really just start a business because somebody tells you it's going to be big and it's a pure execution play, to me, it's a little bit soulless. And I believe that the best businesses, the best startups are started by people that have some kind of connection to the core story or point of the startup. And that's one of the things that drives them is they are truly connected to the mission. Just kind of turning up in a TechCrunch article and saying, yeah, I started this business because I'm passionate about home storage or something like that is not really believable. So those are the two main things that I took away from my Rocket time.
So if I just continue on that last chain of thought, could you walk me through the idea behind your first venture, Satago, and what was your motivation behind doing that?
Yeah, so Satago was a pretty crazy roller coaster. The business was meant to solve the problem of late payments for businesses, particularly B2B companies. And in many countries, including the UK, it's a massive problem for small businesses that their business customers pay them way beyond the agreed terms. So you agree 30 days terms and they pay you in 90 days. And it causes massive cash flow problems. It puts lots of businesses out of business. And I came from a small business background. My father ran a small business in Scotland and in the construction sector. And I always wanted to try and do something to tip the balance back in favor of the small business. And I had this idea that we could build a system to source data directly from the small businesses about when their customers pay them, use that data to build real-time credit reports focused on payment behavior rather than creditworthiness. And yeah, that was where we started it. I mean, the company pivoted a lot, but it really started with that belief of trying to correct an unfairness in the world, that these small businesses have so many problems because of late payment.
So I believe that you'd started thinking about this startup during your MBA itself. And then what was your customer discovery or validation approach over that period of 2 to 3 years leading up to deciding to start Satago?
Yeah, I think this is where I probably did this startup wrong, is that I validated very little in a proper kind of lean startup way. I mostly did almost everything I did there. I did because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought it would work based on my belief, perhaps overinflated belief that I knew what small businesses wanted. To some degree, I was almost mostly correct, yeah. But I did very little customer testing. We just did things I probably was a little bit of a Steve Jobs. The customers don't always know what they want. Let's build what they should want. So very little customer testing. And that did lead to some mistakes, not with the actual product, but more with the positioning, the customer sector that we targeted. So the company Satago eventually became an invoice finance platform. So we provided finance. And one of my mistakes was I was aiming at very small businesses, like almost micro businesses. And I really thought that, okay, well, there's more micro businesses. They don't have access to so much finance. If I target them and finance them, they can use me like an overdraft, and the risk will be spread very, very far over lots of small businesses. Turns out the micro businesses didn't really want finance. And I should have been aiming for the kind of medium-sized businesses. So that was the sort of mistake that I made, is my kind of ideas were right, but maybe my positioning in the market was wrong.
So immediately after Satago, you went through Entrepreneur First, which is a program I went through as well. And EF focuses a lot on being obsessive about that customer validation and discovery process, right? So
Yeah.
could you kind of tell us a bit more about the quantitative pharmacology startup that you and your co-founder were briefly looking at, and how did you approach customer discovery in a different manner after your prior experience in this?
Yeah, so you're right. EF was very good at that idea validation stage. So I was in the first EF batch in Berlin. Sadly, they're not longer doing the batches in the same way as they used to. But my co-founder and I had, I would say really it was his idea to build a kind of mathematical model of the immune system to test drugs on. Obviously drugs go through pharmaceutical testing. I came from a pharmaceutical background, so it made sense for me to be in this startup. Two guys with PhDs talking about something pretty crazy, wacky. And we kind of went back to every single pharma contact that I had in the past and said to them, look, if we built this thing, would you want to use it? Maybe in a bit of a more sophisticated manner, but that's basically what we did. We tested the idea. And of course, everyone said yes, because if such a thing existed, it would be completely world changing. A computer model which accurately represents every single interaction in the immune system. The problem was, I just didn't really think it was like even remotely feasible that we could build this. It was very ambitious, which is what EF likes. They like these kind of moonshot ideas. But I just felt like, okay, there's moonshot, and then there's there's aiming for Alpha Centauri. This is like a little bit. This is a few leaps too far. So my co-founder and I realized that we were not going to be compatible, and decided to pull the plug.
Understood. But that's nice. Sometimes with ventures, people should know when to pull the plug if it's too
Yeah,
early.
that's the thing is we had the investment offer, so we could have gone ahead, but it would have just been a waste of time and, more importantly, money.
Got it. So after EF, you joined Regis 24 as the chief product officer. What excited you about this company, and why did you decide to take a break from entrepreneurship? And how did you adjust to not running the show anymore?
I mean, the first thing was I needed a proper job to try and make some money because
Yeah.
I had gone from the MBA to Rocket Internet. I hadn't been massively paid there. And I only worked there for like 20 months. Startup, I paid myself as little as possible. So I had, by the time my startup finished, I had like 1,000 euros left to my name. So I was in a bit of trouble there. I joined Regis 24 for a few reasons. First of all, they were looking for someone like me. They were looking for a entrepreneurial, atypical person to join the company. They were working with credit data, which is, I was working with business credit data before. They were working with consumer credit data. They had ideas to build things which were sort of in the same space as what I'd built with Zatago. And to be quite honest with you, the company works in German, and I kind of liked the challenge of trying to work in a foreign language. So, I was learning German because I live in Germany, but the best way to accelerate your German is to work in the language. I was like, okay, that seems like an interesting challenge. I'll do it. So, yeah, there was a few things there. I mean, it's not some kind of sexy startup with VC funding or anything like that. Almost nobody's heard of the business, but they had a pretty good tech team that made it seem like it would be a pretty interesting challenge. And also the business challenge was pretty high. They needed a bit of a strategic reinvention. So the business challenge was pretty compelling as well.
And while you were at Regis 24, what were some of your observations there that led to you co-founder Tilores?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to jump back to one of your previous questions for a second. Is how did I adjust to not being in charge? Badly would be the answer. I had massive imposter syndrome because I was in this weird position of kind of coming down to be the chief product officer. I was managing product managers who had worked their way up as a proper product manager, so they knew proper product management. Whereas I'd just been like a random CEO who thought he was good at product and then was suddenly the chief product officer. So that was a little bit tricky. What led me to found Tilores is basically this company as a credit bureau has vast amounts of data, which was normal for a credit bureau. But they had never found a technology on the market that they could use to their satisfaction to manage this data, to connect the data together about the people. And for that reason, they actually built a new technology from scratch to do this, what we call entity or identity resolution, the connecting and deduplication of data. And I thought, well, if there's such a gap in the market that this, little German credit bureau built a technology from scratch, then that suggests a market opportunity. And towards the end of the COVID pandemic, I made the suggestion to the shareholders that that this technology had more potential outside of the credit bureau. A credit bureau is there to sell data, not technology, and I thought, hey, we could sell this technology directly. And that was what led me to propose to the shareholders that we spin the company out into a new entity and raise venture capital money for it directly.
All right. So just to clarify, because we might have some investors in my network also listening to this, this is a venture funded startup as compared to the previous Regis 24, which is bootstrapped.
Regis 24, it was actually bootstrapped originally. I mean, it took a little bit of kind of private angel investment money, and so, but essentially it was organically grown to the size it was. Tilores is a kind of typical venture-funded tech startup, yeah.
All right. So just diving deeper into the technology behind Tilores, um, could you explain the technology that drives Tilores under the hood? Maybe without being too technical. I guess there would be some people here for whom they would prefer
Sure.
a non-technical.
So we've built the technology based on AWS, so Amazon's hosting stack, specifically AWS serverless stack. And what we do is we connect to our customers' systems via API. We ingest individual data records as they are created, or as they are created in our customer systems. Each time it's created, we kind of instantly search within Tilores to see, does this person already exist in a slightly different form? So what it's doing is what's called fuzzy matching, fuzzy data matching. So, for example, if you take my name, Steven, you can spell it either Steven or Stephen. It's the same name. It could be misspelt, but actually checking that is quite resource intensive. So what we have is a rules-based system which uses fuzzy matching on the attributes of the data. So like name, date of birth, address, phone number, email address, IP address, and uses rules based on that to say, okay, that person actually matches to another person. If we find that they do match, then we basically connect them together so that we form these so-called identity graphs of data, so that every single record about a person is connected together into one entity. And then the specific edge that we have is, first of all, the real-time data ingestion. Many comparable systems would do this data on a batch basis. And then very fast searching of the data. So no matter how complex these entities, these identity graphs get, we'll always retrieve them in 150 milliseconds. So there's other bits and bobs to it, but that's the main thrust of it. It's very useful for data scientists so that they can build their machine learning models on complete data rather than partial records. It's a very, very powerful system. And because it's based in AWS serverless, it's kind of automatically scaling. So if you've got an e-commerce shop and suddenly you get 10 times more customers because it's Black Friday, the system will automatically scale.
Understood. And in this case, who would be your typical consumers?
So that's part of what we're trying to work out just now. But largely it's risk and fraud engineering teams. So if you're working in e-commerce fraud prevention, credit risk analysis, that sort of area. Also a little bit in the kind of compliance side of things. So if you're working in FinTech doing compliance, then that would be the other sort of area. But it's largely aimed at tech people.
Understood. I saw a very engaging video of yours on your LinkedIn where you explained the concept of data swarms. You mentioned some of the problems faced by companies trying to fight fraud, and you also shared one of your client success stories as well. Could you share that story with our audience as well?
Yeah, I think you mean data swamps, not swarms.
My bad, data swarms.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there, my analogy is that, in the data world, there's lots of buzzwords. There's data warehouses, and there's data lakes, right? So, and my point in that talk is that people talk about data lakes, but actually they've probably got more of a data swamp, i.e., it's a mess, and you can't really use the data, even though it's all in one place. So the success story that I mentioned in the talk you referenced is a large kind of buy now, pay later e-commerce player in Europe. They have a particular technology in their fraud prevention stack called Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is a search engine, and they used that for their entity resolution. It's a very powerful search engine, but it's not good for entity resolution because it's too slow and difficult to scale. So we did a data test with them to see if we could identify networks or suspicious-looking networks of customers. Turns out we can. So we discovered these connections between their customers, which they were not even aware of. We identified all the fraud that they knew about, and we just identified hundreds of thousands of euros worth of fraud that they didn't know about. So yeah, that was I think we calculated that for every euro they spent on us, they would save or prevent 50 euros worth of losses from fraud. So quite a compelling business case. Plus, using us, they have a system which requires no maintenance and scales automatically. So they are currently in the process of replacing Elasticsearch with Tilores for their fraud prevention.
It's very nice. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
What's your vision for Tilores, and where are you currently on your growth journey?
I mean, we're super early stage. The vision is to be a company which excels in creating order from chaos in the data world. So connecting together disparate data for whatever use case, whether it's your customer CRM or fraud prevention database, we want to be there to allow people to get better value from their data. We are basically pre-seed funded, so very early, very small team, and we've got our first few customers, we've got our first few bigger customers, and now we need to find a repeatable go-to-market strategy, which is pretty difficult because it's a difficult technology to sell because it's a little bit horizontal. It's like a database technology. It can be used for fraud prevention, but it's arguably not a direct fraud prevention tool. So we're trying to work out how to best position this, how to best sell it, and really who our ideal customer profile is. So we hopefully sometime towards the end of this year or early next year, we'll raise a seed investment round to scale things up a little bit.
Understood. So if I go back to your early beginnings as a scientist or working in science, how have you applied this scientific method as an entrepreneur? Do you have any advice for aspiring entrepreneurs who might listen to this podcast to help them get their ventures off the ground in a sustainable manner?
Right. Have I applied the scientific method? Hard to say. I would say in Satago I probably didn't. That's a large part of my mistakes. Now I am trying. It's difficult to be rigorous when you're doing these startups because you're kind of mostly flying by the seat of your pants. So applying rigorous methodologies is tough. At the minute, for example, I'm doing a lot of outbound email testing, and I have my hypotheses. I try and test them. I try and measure what I can, and then adjust from there. So yeah, it applies to things that you can measure well, like larger scale outbound email marketing. My advice to new entrepreneurs, well, I guess it depends what you want to do. I'm a big fan nowadays of bootstrapping. I'm a big fan of no-code development. So if I was doing a different startup, like this startup had to be funded by venture capital money. There's no way we could have got this going without. But if I was to be doing something else, I would probably try and validate the idea a lot more, first of all, before doing a single thing, just by doing, customer interviews. If I find 10 people that tell me they would pay for it, then there's probably something there. Build a prototype in a no-code tool like Bubble. You don't need to be an engineer these days to build viable web applications, at least the MVPs, and test from there and try to not raise venture capital money until you think you need it to really change the angle of your growth. And I think you can get quite a long way without VC money these days, as is shown by lots of kind of bootstrap companies that are out there.
What's your approach towards mental wellness and stress management? Have you found any activities that work particularly well for you?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is always to try and do a bit of sport. When I was at Oxford, I took up rowing. So I was in Green Templeton and rowed a lot there. And I really found that doing exercise, I bought a rowing machine. Eventually, I would go to the rowing machine in the gym afterwards. And I really found that doing that for several times a week helped me reduce the stress quite a bit. And it's easy to think you're too busy, but stress can creep up on you and start affecting you without you really realizing it. And it does affect you physically, not just mentally. So I always felt like doing a really hard workout kind of reset my body a little bit. So that would be the main thing. Obviously, be careful with what you eat and don't drink too much. But hey, I'm Scottish. I need to drink a bit.
Just curious. I mean, like, what ended up leading to you to switch from the UK to Germany, and how did that switch go for you?
So I'd always been jealous, because I was working in science. I was always working with international people. This was pre-Brexit. So I was always impressed and jealous of all these foreign people that I was working with who spoke English impeccably. And I was always embarrassed that I was pretty much a monoglot. And I studied French and German at school, French for 5 years and German for 3 years. I always hated German. And in that way, it was the bigger challenge. So I was working for Rocket Internet in London, and they're obviously a German company. They offered me a job in the HQ. I was like, okay, this is my chance to move. Moved to Berlin, which sounded like it could be an interesting city, capital city of Germany. Why not go for it? And 11 years later, I'm still here. So I guess it must have worked out okay. I have got German citizenship, so I'm kind of Brexit proofed. I still have the British citizenship, but I got German dual nationality. So I really love it. I've integrated relatively well here. My German language skills have plateaued a little bit because I don't work in German anymore. So possibly they've regressed. But I've really enjoyed the experience of living in a different culture.
So in a way, you've also seen the Berlin tech scene grow up from its infancy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rocket Internet was a large driver of the early tech scene in Berlin. Back then, there was only a handful of VC firms in Berlin. Now there's a lot. And if you look at the successful startups in Berlin, a significant proportion of them have got some kind of Rocket Internet background in the founders, or at least the senior team. I would say it's close to 50% of big-ish or successful tech companies in Berlin have got somebody from Rocket there. So Rocket Internet were really good at finding people, especially good executors. Whether or not they were the people that had the great idea in the first place is maybe a different question, but they were definitely talented people, and they have left a good legacy in the city.
And just for the curiosity of people who might be listening, when you talk about roles in Berlin tech startups or Berlin VCs, is there normally a requirement for you to know how to speak English? Though I know in your case you were mainly working in English.
The entire tech world here works in English, so you don't need to speak German at all.
All right, that can be helpful to some people. So,
for sure.
Steven, this has been a very insightful podcast. Thank you for sharing a lot of your experience. Where would be the best place for people to reach you?
Well, email. They can email me, steven.renwick@gmail.com. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. So if Twitter still exists by the time you listen to this, then my handle there is major_grooves. So either there, or you can try and find me on LinkedIn as well.
Sure, I'll make sure to drop all of those links into the description. So
cool.
Thank you, Steven.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for...
Thank you for tuning into OxIgnite. Please reach out to Yusuf, Raza, or Michael Hutson on LinkedIn if you are an entrepreneur with ties to Oxford and want to create more awareness about your venture, or if you are an investor interested in investing in Oxford-linked startups, or if you are a brand that wants to sponsor an episode of the OxIgnite podcast. If you like this podcast, please help us spread the word to your network. We would also welcome any donations to help us scale this podcast. You can donate at buymeacoffee.com/OxIgnite, OXIGNITE.